There is a room in every palace that no one describes, not the throne room, not the hall of portraits or the chapel with its painted ceiling, not the banquet chamber where candlelight doubled itself across polished silver. The room no one describes is smaller, quieter. It sits behind a door that the official record never names. It has a window, usually, overlooking a garden the woman inside was rarely permitted to enter without escort. The furniture is fine. The fire, when lit, offers warmth. From the outside, everything about this room suggests comfort, but comfort and captivity can wear the same face, and for centuries they did. The story of royal women was told in announcements, in treaties, in the brief, formal lines that record a marriage, a birth, a death. The language is administrative. It was always meant to be, because the moment you allowed the private account, the letter never sent, the grief never spoken aloud, the decision made for a girl who was never asked, the entire architecture of royal tradition would require a different kind of examination. That examination was rarely permitted. This is it. She would have understood her position before she fully understood herself, not through cruelty, through repetition, through the careful, consistent way the world around her reflected back a single truth, that her life was not only hers, that it was, in some fundamental sense, a resource, to be allocated, to be deployed, to serve purposes she had not chosen and would not, in most cases, be consulted about. The lessons began early. Languages, not the ones she was drawn to, but the ones she might need in a foreign court. History, not as something to question, but as a pattern of alliances, precedents, cautionary examples. Comportment, always. How to receive guests without revealing discomfort. How to exit a room in a manner that communicated neither haste nor reluctance. How to hold a face still. These were not cruelties, according to those who administered them. They were preparations. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand before anything else is said. The system that consumed royal women was not built on malice. It was built on logic, a cold, self-reinforcing logic that treated the movement of a girl from one dynasty to another as simply one instrument of governance among many, no more sentimental and no less necessary than a contested border or a trade route. She was a diplomatic asset. She had been one from birth. The negotiations, in many cases, began before she was old enough to comprehend them. Envoys would arrive, letters would be exchanged, men who had never met her and would never meet her debated the terms of her future in rooms she was not invited to enter. Her age, her health, her reported temperament, these became bargaining details, offered alongside territorial concessions and trade privileges. The personal and the political were not separated. They were the same conversation. And once the terms were agreed, the engagement was real. Real in the way that a document is real, in the way that a seal pressed into wax is real. The girl herself might receive the news formally, in a ceremony designed to mark the occasion as an honor. Gifts would arrive. There would be celebration in the halls. No one asked what she thought. In many recorded cases, there was genuinely nothing to ask. The decision had been made at a level so far above her own that dissent was not a conceivable response. Not because she lacked the capacity for it, but because the system had been engineered to make dissent unthinkable. To question the engagement was to question the treaty. To question the treaty was to endanger the peace. To endanger the peace was to bring ruin. The weight of nations, quietly and efficiently, was placed on a girl's silence. She would leave everything she had ever known, not eventually, on a date that had been set without her input. She would leave the language she dreamed in, the faces she had memorized over years of daily proximity, the particular quality of light through particular windows in the early morning. She would leave the servants who knew her habits, the courtyard where she had moved without being watched, the prayers she had learned in a tongue that still felt natural in her mouth.
The procession that carried her away was ceremonial. There would be crowds, in many cases, music, the formal theater of a nation releasing one of its most valuable possessions into the keeping of another. She was dressed for the occasion. She rode or was carried according to the custom of her court. People along the route would have seen a young woman elevated and honored, moving toward a destiny that represented the highest ambition the world around her could conceive. What they could not see was the direction she refused to look. Back toward everything receding, back toward the last version of herself that had existed before the document was sealed. She would arrive somewhere else and be expected to become someone else's princess immediately. The foreign court had its own rhythms, its own hierarchies, its own unspoken laws about who held influence and who was merely tolerated. The language she had studied would prove insufficient for the texture of daily life, the idioms, the inflections, the ways that words could be used not to communicate meaning, but to signal allegiance. She would smile at the wrong moments and remain too serious at others, and spend years decoding a social architecture that everyone around her had inherited from childhood. They would not be unkind about this necessarily, they would simply be watching.
Her attendants, those few who had traveled with her, were often gradually replaced. The court had its own ladies, its own trusted women, whose loyalty belonged to the dynasty she had married into rather than to the dynasty she carried in her blood. Over months, sometimes years, the circle of familiar faces shrank. The circle of unfamiliar ones, with their careful eyes and considered silences, expanded. She learned to be precise about what she said and to whom. She learned that every private conversation had the potential to become a public document. The body was political. This was not a metaphor, it was operational reality. A royal woman's capacity to conceive, to carry, to deliver, these were monitored with an attention that left no room for privacy. The pressure was relentless, not because of any individual cruelty, but because the logic was systemic. The dynasty required continuation. Continuation required heirs. Heirs required her. And if the heirs did not come, the question was never asked about the man. The question was always about her. Medicine would be consulted, remedies would be administered. The women around her would watch her body for signs, report on her health with the same detached precision with which a surveyor might record the condition of land. Her reproductive history became a matter of state record. Her failures, because they were consistently framed as failures, became vulnerabilities. In more than a few documented cases, the failure to produce an heir was used not merely as a source of personal grief, but as a pretext for something far more consequential. A second marriage could be sought, an annulment pursued. The woman, having given years of her life to a foreign court, could find herself quietly repositioned, removed from the center of things to some estate in the countryside, some small castle on a quiet border, some convent where the world would stop looking at her. The dynasty moved on. She did not. The palace had eyes that never closed. She understood this. She had, over time, learned to accept it as simply a condition of the life. But understanding something and living easily within it are different arrangements of the mind. The letters she received were read before she received them. The letters she wrote were read before they were sent, if they were sent. Visitors were vetted. The women assigned to her were, in many cases, explicitly responsible for reporting on her behavior, her moods, her conversations. The phrase ladies in waiting carries a softness that the function never quite deserved. These women waited, yes, they also watched. Not always with hostility, some were genuinely loyal, some came to protect rather than surveil. But the structure itself was one of managed transparency. A royal woman was not expected to have a private inner life that functioned independently of institutional oversight. Her emotional states were relevant data. Her correspondences were relevant records. The architecture of her daily existence, who she could see, when she could move through the palace, what hours were accounted for and what hours were not, was controlled by protocols that predated her arrival and would outlast her departure. She lived inside a machine that had been running long before she was born, and it ran quietly. Quietly is important. The most effective systems of control are the ones that require no visible chains. She was not confined in any crude sense. She could move through rooms, attend ceremonies, walk in gardens. She could speak and laugh and present to any observer the image of a woman at ease with her position. But she could not leave. She could not refuse. She could not exist, even privately, as someone who belonged entirely to herself. The machinery, when it turned against a woman, required only the smallest adjustment. A whisper in the right corridor, a letter that arrived at the wrong moment, an association, however slight, with someone who had fallen from favor, a childhood friend now considered a political liability, a confessor whose beliefs had become inconvenient, a family member from the court she had left behind who had made enemies in the years since her departure. Scandal was rarely constructed from nothing. It was constructed from implication, from pattern, from the careful arrangement of available facts into a shape that served someone else's interest. The accusations that brought royal women down, immorality, betrayal, heresy, conspiracy, were not always fabricated. Sometimes they contained a thread of truth that had been woven into something far larger and more damning than the thread itself warranted. And once the accusation was in the air, the architecture of surveillance that had surrounded her throughout her marriage became something else entirely. Every watched letter, every monitored conversation, every recorded visit, all of it was now evidence. Evidence that had been gathered without her knowledge, cataloged without her consent, available to be deployed at a moment of political necessity. The very systems designed to manage her were now instruments for her undoing. She would be removed to an estate, a castle, a religious institution. The language used was often gentle, a period of withdrawal, a recommendation for quiet and prayer. The reality was erasure. She was taken out of the room where decisions were made, and the door was closed, and the business of the court continued without her. No trial, in many cases, no public reckoning, just absence.
What it cost cannot be found in the official record, because the official record was not built to carry that kind of weight. It was built to record outcomes, marriages concluded, children born or not born, titles held or revoked, estates assigned, deaths noted and dated. The human interior, what a woman felt in the long silence of a foreign winter, what happened to a person who had been useful and was now inconvenient, what the years of managed performance and constant observation actually produced inside a human being who had learned to show nothing, none of that was considered archivable. The loss of a native language's fluency, the fading of childhood memories until they were no longer certain, until she could not be entirely sure whether she remembered her mother's face or had simply reconstructed it so many times that the reconstruction had replaced the original. The friendships that could not be sustained across borders, across political alignments that shifted with every new treaty. The slow, meticulous accumulation of small losses that, taken individually, were each too minor to mention, but taken together represented the replacement of a self. She had arrived somewhere. Over years, she had become someone. Whether that someone had any relation to the someone she might have become elsewhere under different conditions, that question was not asked. There was no one to ask it to. The grief, when it existed, was private. It had to be private. Grief was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities were dangerous, and she had been trained since girlhood to understand that dangerous things required concealment. So she concealed it. She sat in the fine room with the fire and the window overlooking the garden, and she held her face in the position that had been practiced into her over decades. And if she wept alone. And the aloneness itself is what the record missed entirely. After she was gone, the record was rewritten, not with violence, with bureaucratic patience.
The histories of dynasties were composed by men working under the patronage of institutions that had every reason to present the institution favorably. A woman who had been discarded could be reframed as one who had retired. A woman who had been confined could be described as one who had sought seclusion. A woman who had resisted, even quietly, could simply be omitted. Her presence in the archive reduced to the minimum necessary acknowledgement of her existence, her marriage, and her end. What she thought was not recorded.
Even her name, in some cases, was subordinated, appearing in the historical account only as an appendage to the man she had married, identified in relation to him rather than to herself. Daughter of, wife of, mother of. The grammatical construction of historical memory placed her in permanent subordination, even in death. The silences in the archive are not accidental. They are a record of what was decided not to keep. A kingdom writes its history toward its own coherence, toward the narrative that justifies the decisions that were made. And a woman who had been used and discarded by the mechanism of royal tradition was not useful to that narrative. She was at best a minor detail, at worst an inconvenience. So the silence grew around her. It grew tidily, officially, with the full cooperation of the institutions that had defined her life. But there were those who refused the silence that was prepared for them. Not loudly. The ones who survived long enough to matter had understood from long experience that loudness was a form of self-destruction. They worked in the registers that were available to them: patronage, correspondence, the quiet construction of networks that functioned beneath the visibility threshold of official court politics. A word placed with the right confessor, money directed to a monastery that would, in return, preserve certain documents, a friendship cultivated with a woman whose husband held a position of influence, so that when the moment came, the favor could be called. Letters written with a careful double meaning, legible to the censor as personal correspondence, legible to the intended recipient as something far more specific. They could not fight the system openly. They learned to move within it the way water moves within stone, finding the grain, following the existing lines, never forcing a passage directly, but wearing the resistance down through sustained and patient pressure. Some of them reshaped things, not always visibly. The effect of their work often appeared elsewhere, in a decision that was made that should not have been, in a document that was preserved that should have been destroyed, in a child who was raised with a certain understanding of the world that would later produce consequences no one in the official record knew to attribute to her. She did not receive the credit. She was not meant to receive the credit. The effectiveness of her influence depended precisely on its invisibility. But it was real, and the women who exercised it, who chose in the silence that had been assigned to them to build something rather than simply to endure, represent a dimension of royal history that the official record was specifically designed to exclude. A crown was offered as the highest elevation a woman could achieve. This was the promise, stated or implied, that moved through every element of the training, the ceremonies, the carefully managed transition from girl to wife to queen. That all of it, the displacement, the surveillance, the reproductive pressure, the loss of the private self, was not a cost but a privilege. That to be chosen for this life was to be honored. That the sacrifice was meaningful because the institution was meaningful. And many women accepted this framing, because the alternative, to understand it as extraction, as managed use, as the systematic consumption of a person in service of an apparatus that would not remember her with accuracy, required living inside a kind of clarity that had nowhere to go. The institution gave the sacrifice meaning. Without the institution, it was simply loss. So the meaning was maintained, officially, structurally, in the language of the ceremonies and the histories and the official portraits, where she stood in silk with her hands at the correct angle and her face arranged into the expression that had been agreed upon. Behind that expression was a woman.
She had a language she sometimes still dreamed in, that by the end had become an inheritance she could no longer fully claim. She had a childhood garden she could describe precisely if anyone had asked, which they did not. She had a version of herself that had existed before the negotiations began, before the document was sealed, before the carriage crossed the border into a country that would become her life, but never entirely her home. That version was not preserved.
It had served its purpose. What remains is pattern. Not the story of one woman, the story of many, overlaid so precisely that the outlines become indistinguishable, the same isolation arriving in the same way, the same surveillance from the same directions, the same silence installed with the same administrative efficiency, the same erasure carried out with the same clerical patience. The pattern is itself the document. Because when one woman's suffering could be dismissed as individual, as personal misfortune, as the private difficulty of a specific life, the pattern removes that option. The pattern says this was not accidental. This was not the unfortunate byproduct of some otherwise functioning system. This was the system. This was what the system required and what the system produced, reliably across centuries, in courts separated by language and religion and geography, but unified by the same structural logic. She was a resource. When she was useful, she was maintained. When she ceased to be useful, she was managed. When she became inconvenient, she was erased. And the record that remains was written by the institution that performed the erasure. This is what was kept from the history that was handed down. Not the dates, not the names of the queens and the treaties, those were preserved. What was kept from it was the texture of the private life, the room with the fire and the garden window, the letter that was written and then read by other eyes before it reached the person it was meant for, the grief held still in a trained face, the self that had been prepared and deployed and, eventually, when the deployment was complete, simply set aside. She carried a dynasty's ambitions across a border. She was the instrument of someone else's permanence. And when it was over, the permanence remained. She did not. The silence that followed was not passive. It was chosen, and it held for a very long time. There is still a room in every palace that no one describes. The official tour does not include it. The commemorative portrait does not depict it. The name of the woman who sat within it, who watched the garden she rarely entered and held the face she had been trained to hold, is preserved in a single administrative line. Married on this date, died on that one. As though the decades between were simply weather. As though the life lived inside that room had no texture worth recording, no interior worth preserving, no grief worth the cost of ink. But you are here now, and you have read what the record refused to say. A crown can elevate a dynasty. For some princesses, it became a private sentence. The sentence was long, and it was served in a silence the institution had perfected over generations, so complete, so structurally enforced, that it came to feel like the natural order of things. It was not.